UK. So in England, in confidence in the UK government is at about 29%. In Scotland, it's about 70%. And I think that speaks to a very different way of approaching the public. I mean, in Scotland, it's been talked about much more in terms of a partnership where instead of blaming the public and telling the public off, what you seek to do is to support the public to do the right thing, at which point people are far more likely to reciprocate. If you wave a big stick at people and tell them that they're behaving badly and they're doing wrong things, then you tend to get what a process called reactance. People seek to reassert their autonomy by reacting against you. So I think the way in which we treat the government, the public, treating them as a partner rather than a problem, is very important indeed.
And how accurately are people measuring their own risk?
I think one of the problems is very much that if you set up a view whereby we're told, look, it's somebody else who's the problem. You know, the problem is these young people with their big house parties. And the danger is that other people become complacent about their own violations. And again, if you look at the figures, say, of house gatherings, what you see is very, very few of them are big house parties, only about 3 or 4%. The great majority are people inviting, you know, 1 or 2 more people round, and yet thinking, well, we're not the problem, somebody else is the problem. So again, I think blame, and in particular blaming particular groups, makes other people complacent and takes up the focus away from the fact that all of us have a responsibility to act within the rules if we want to contain the pandemic.
Is there still a sense, which I think a lot of people felt at the very beginning back in March, of we're all in this together, or has that been slightly nibbled away at by the idea of regional lockdowns?
Again, I think it's a matter of balance. I think the evidence showed very strongly, as you say early on, there was a strong sense of national identity. What's more, there's now evidence showing that that sense of national identity is really important in terms of compliance. A big study, 67 nations, 47,000 people, showed that a sense of belonging to a national community is strongly related to adherence. So keeping together that sense is not only something psychologically important, it's very important in terms of adherence and controlling the pandemic. I think it's been undermined to some extent, but I think, again, it's important not to focus on, if you like, the violations. On the whole, it's still there to a substantial effect. And as I say, it's very important indeed. In fact, in many ways, it's the key for us acting together, supporting each other, and controlling the pandemic.
Stephen Leisher, Professor of Social Psychology at the University of St Andrews, thank you. So Keir Starmer has been defending Labour's decision to suspend Jeremy Corbyn from the party after the former leader's reaction to a report on anti-Semitism in Labour under Corbyn's leadership. Mr Corbyn said the scale of Labour anti-Semitism had been dramatically overstated by his opponents, a comment that prompted the party to suspend him. Some of his supporters have since warned of a civil war within Labour. This was Keir Starmer's response today.
There is no reason for a civil war. There is no reason to lean inwards. That is not what I want. I want to unite the party. That is the basis on which I ran my leadership campaign. I want to unite the party to stop the factional fighting. But I also made a very clear commitment to root out anti-Semitism. This is a matter of values for me. It's about what I believe, and it's what the Labour Party believes in. It's not even about the electoral strategy. It's something fundamental to being Labour in the Labour Party, and I'm not going to renege on that commitment.
Well, we spoke to 3 Labour activists to hear what they think will happen next to the party. Lena is a Labour supporter in Islington, a neighbouring constituency to Jeremy Corbyn's. Lloyd lives in Sir Keir Starmer's seat of Holborn and St Pancras, and Keir is a Labour activist in Jeremy Corbyn's constituency. He started by giving me his reaction to Mr Corbyn's suspension.
It came as a shock to me. I joined the Labour Party because I thought Jeremy Corbyn was offering that. Now, this is not to say there weren't favours, of course there is, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but seeing him be suspended felt like it was a reprisal against that entire legacy. That thing that, thousands of young people and vain people across the country were infused by Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and felt that we actually had a voice within politics for once, and that things could start to change and we could start to see a fairer society where the rich aren't getting richer and the poor aren't getting poorer, and maybe we can actually get a fairer deal out of it. And it felt like this is the Labour Party's way of saying that style of politics is over. We're going back to people in suits debating in Westminster and your voice doesn't matter anymore.
And Lena, did you feel similarly?
I would say no, because there is an element of wanting to perhaps move on from the past, and I don't know if it's necessarily the legacy that Corbyn had left behind, but it's potentially the legacy that was left when we lost the election in 2019. So I totally appreciate what was said before about, are we moving towards sort of suits and, people standing up in Parliament and sort of getting involved in all that sort of bureaucratic, old school way of doing things. I don't know if that's where we're heading. I appreciate that could feel like that's where we're heading, but I think the jury's out to see what happens next.
Jeremy Corbyn was suspended for his reaction to the EHRC report, not for the report itself. Do you think it was the right thing, Lloyd?
I think what Keir and the sort of leadership of the party did yesterday was certainly a tough decision. They made a tough decision, but it was ultimately the right one. And it was about Jeremy Corbyn's reaction. We had this big report drop on everyone's table saying, this is, the Labour Party has committed unlawful acts and discriminated against Jewish people, and that's an independent report. That's a really big deal. And within sort of minutes, Jeremy Corbyn denies the extent of the problem and then starts attacking people and saying that they were only sort of calling out anti-Semitism because they were politically motivated. And I think that's terrible, and he didn't let the dust settle. So this sort of knee-jerk reaction from him, where he's sort of denying the problem, does sadly make him part of the problem. Keir Starmer made a really tough but principled decision.
Len McCluskey, the leader of the Unite Union, says the decision to suspend Mr Corbyn was wrong and unjust, but he's been appealing to Labour members today to stay in the party. Keir, are you thinking of leaving Labour because of this, and do you know others who might?
I know people who have already, and I'll be honest, it's crossed my mind a lot. I'm going to be staying because I still want my voice to be heard in politics. I still want to let the Labour Party know, which I still think is the best vehicle for progressive change in this country. But I completely understand why people are leaving, because it is exhausting. It's spending your evenings going to meetings. It's not fun Labour Party meetings. It's, going out on the doorstep during election, wasn't particularly fun in the pouring rain and trying to convince people to vote Labour.
And Lena, what about you and your friends? Might this open the way for others, perhaps more to the centre or the right of the party, perhaps those who left when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, to come back to Labour?
For me, I'll stay and see what happens next, really. I guess it's difficult because where else do you go? Like, similar to Keir, I sort of believe that the Labour Party's got to be really progressive. And where do you go if you can't? Like, in a two-party system that the country exists in, you can't go anywhere else. What's the alternative? I kind of need to look at it and I'm not the electorate, it's just me, and maybe you need to try and find some level of compromise. I don't know.
And Lloyd, do you think this will make it easier or harder for you when you next canvass for Labour on the doorsteps?
Just listening to the other two speakers, we do need to take a step back here. And I think Keir mentioned that, it was no fun knocking on doors in the rain last year. And I agree it was no fun. But for me, the number one reason why it was no fun was because Labour voter after Labour voter was turning away from the Labour Party in droves. And one of the reasons, among others, was that there was a fake it and that Labour leadership was often on anti-Semitism. So I think this is a really important decision that Keir has made. And we sort of stop this inward looking, and we turn out, I think, that the public will probably support it, and I'll go, here is a leader who is acting decisively, and that's something that I can get behind. People want to see their political leaders acting decisively, and Keir has done that. So I think next time we do knock on doors and talk to voters after this pandemic is over, we will hear people being a lot more positive about the Labour Party, and I think one of the chief reasons for that be that they see the Labour Party is led by someone who is competent, who is principled, is decisive, and means what they say.
Labour activist Lloyd, Keir and Lena. It is coming up to 46. Jim Lee,
Government scientific advisors have said the rate that coronavirus is spreading in England is exceeding the reasonable worst-case scenario. The leader of the Unite Union, Republicans urge Labour members angry about the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn to stay in the party. Sir Keir Starmer has appealed for unity and an end to factional fighting. Nobby Stiles, a member of England's 1966 World Cup winning team, has died aged 78 after a long illness.
Thanks, Jim. We've been hearing from America over this week as our correspondent Ben Wright follows the campaign trail ahead of Tuesday's vote. As we head into the final weekend of the US election campaign, Ben's been hearing from voters worried about the possibility of political violence and talking to African American voters in Detroit, where Donald Trump won by just 10,000 votes in 2016.
People talk a lot about Midwestern values. Here in Michigan, we live those values.
The brooding mood of this Democratic campaign ad mirrored what I expected to find in Motor City. In 2016, Hillary Clinton lost this state by less than 11,000 votes. That's a sixth of Detroit's baseball ground capacity when it reopens.
But we're hurting in Michigan right now. In our factories, on our farms, in our hearts.
All through this storm and sleepless night, I hear my neighbors talking.
But Detroit was dazzling. And whether it was the towering Art Deco skyline, the huge Canadian flag flying on the opposite side of the river, or the four tops on the radio that distracted me, I ended up driving by mistake into a queue of cars waiting to drop their early ballots off at a downtown election office.
How you doing, man? You guys got my ballots? I'll just sign off on? All right, thank you.
Detroit is a democratic city with an 80% black population. If Joe Biden wants to win this state, he needs African Americans to vote in bigger numbers than they did 4 years ago.
We're coming together as a community.
Do you think that more black people in Detroit will be voting this year than previous elections?
As long as Trump is in the office, everybody and their grandma gonna come out and vote. Trust me, we're not letting Trump get in there. And welcome to Detroit.
I think people are more eager to get out there and do what they have to do because our lives are at stake.
I'm personally scared for the future of this country if he does win again.
There are some black people in Detroit who are backing Trump. I'm going to one of their rallies later. Do you understand how they could?
Yeah, a lot of them are rich, so yeah.
Continues Radio 950. Well, tonight will be showing.
I headed out to the suburbs, where a rally for Donald Trump was being held for a huge roster of Republican campaign groups. My assumptions challenged again.
Trump Victory Middle East Coalition, Trump Victory Lebanese.
I talked to Robin Burns and Bobby Heston from Black Voices for Trump.
I've done door-to-door outreach, and there is a lot of support for President Trump in the black community. But the thing is, a lot of them are quiet about it because they don't want to be interjected by their community because it's not a very popular thing to support President Trump if you're black.
I've just come from downtown talking to African American voters casting their ballots. Pretty much everyone I asked, they said the only African Americans who will vote for Trump are the ones that can afford to. Richer African Americans.
That's not true. I mean, I'm not rich. I want to be, but no, I'm not. We're backing him because of our Christian values, how we feel about schools, not only economics, even how he's ran this COVID situation. I'm a COVID survivor. He did a great job.
It's very unlikely we're going to get a clean result on the night of this election because of all the mail-in ballots. Are you worried about civil unrest?
Well, I haven't seen any conservative extremists. The extremists that I see are people from Antifa.
Well, there was a right-wing extremist group that tried to kidnap the governor of this state.
Actually, can I correct you on that? They are anarchists. They are anti-Trump.
So you don't think the right-wing militias are a problem or a threat?
No. We actually had anti-lockdown marches up in Lansing. There were people there with AR-15s. Everything was peaceful. There was no looting, shooting, burning, and raping like we're seeing in a lot of these Democrat-run cities. By white people who claim to support black people, and they come to our black neighborhoods and they burn our stores down, they burn our businesses down in the name of Black Lives Matter.
And we're following a lot of breaking news today. Now this out of Michigan, where the FBI says that they stopped a plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. 6 men have been arrested and charged.
A concern many Americans have voiced to me during this trip is what might happen if counting the tens of millions of postal ballots means that it's days before we get a result. This month in Michigan, the potential threat from extremist militias hit the headlines.
You know, it's incredibly disturbing that 10 days after a plot to kidnap, put me on trial, and execute me, the president is at it again and inspiring and inciting domestic terrorism.
And then I guess they said she was threatened, right? And she blamed me. She blamed me.
Election officials around the United States are preparing for a slower vote count than usual. I talked to Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State for Michigan.
We estimate it'll take about 80 hours to tabulate every ballot effectively and methodically to ensure accuracy.
But there is clearly the potential for a vacuum in that moment between polls closing and you finally announcing the results, where disorder could happen. How concerned are you by that?
Clearly, you're right. It is a potential. We've been very focused on that space, that time, and making sure that we provide enough information so that there is not a vacuum, that instead there is an abundance of information. I will be offering tours of facilities, holding press conferences from locations where those ballots are being counted. And so we're going to tell the story of the count as it happens to the public so that when the results are announced, they can have confidence in those results as an accurate reflection of the will of the people.
And while there is some foreboding about this unique election, when I drove back downtown, I saw again the vigor of American democracy. Biden or Trump, people want their say.
You gonna talk about ballots?
Yep.
All right, fine. Yep, thank you. You have a good day.
After a week talking politics with voters in the Midwest, I don't know what will happen next week. Donald Trump supporters seem as fired up as ever. Joe Biden's ranks want the quieter candidate to return America to a calmer way of life. The people I've met were as genial and welcoming as ever, but the fractures running through the United States will not heal quickly, whoever wins this election.
And that was Ben Wright reporting from Detroit. Nobby Stiles, part of the World Cup winning England team in 1966, has died at the age of 78 after a long illness. The manager of that 66 team was the late, great Sir Alf Ramsey, who had this to say about Nobby.
I've always inferred that Nobby Stiles always played the ball. And you saw this today in as much that Nobby Stiles is a great player. And I'm proud that he is an Englishman, and I'm proud that he was in the England team.
Sir Geoff Hurst, who scored a hat-trick in that final, said he was hugely sad to hear that Nobby had died, and that he had great character, was the heart and soul of the team, and that he would be sorely missed. Stiles also had a career as a coach and manager, training up the likes of the Neville brothers, Paul Scholes at Manchester United. Former England captain David Beckham said he'd be forever grateful for the support and passion Stiles showed him and all the other youth team players when they were young kids. He said, "Thank you for everything." And just before we came on air, I asked the former England captain, Gary Lineker, how he'd remember Nobby Stiles.
Well, like most people, I think dancing with the World Cup trophy with false teeth in his other hand. I think obviously he was one of the heroes of 66. I think he played every minute of the whole tournament. And such great memories, and we've lost another one of our 66 World Cup winning heroes. And he was obviously a great character. And he was a kind of destroyer as a footballer, like a modern day, you'd describe him as probably a holding midfield player. Tough tackling, uncompromising. And I think most of us, in terms of great performances, I mean, he was excellent in the World Cup final itself, but also in the semi-final, he was given the job by Sir Alf Ramsey of marking Eusebio. And he marked him out of the game, which I think clinched it for us, as well as obviously Bobby Charlton's 2 great goals.
What was his career like after that 1966 victory?
He was successful, of course, with Manchester United. He was a European Cup winner. I think he's one of only 3 Englishmen to have won the double of the World Cup and the European Cup, or Champions League as we now know it, of course, along with Bobby Charlton and I think Ian Callaghan, I think, was the other one, even though he didn't play in the World Cup final. He was, I think, latterly granted a World Cup winner's medal as everyone else was in the squad. So, yeah, his achievements are great. I think he only played, 28, something like that, games for England, but they were very important ones, obviously. And I think he was just such a wonderful character, and he was much loved in the game, and obviously he's had a a long illness, and it's very sad that he's left us.
He's now the 7th member of that England team to die, and in a sense, he's from an era of football that is now passing.
Well, of course, and that does happen. I mean, obviously, it's a long time ago. I think he's approaching 80, 78, I think he was. We've lost a number of players, and a few of them recently. Jack Charlton went not too long ago as well. And it's a sign that the times are passing, like you said, and they're kind of an old bunch now, the ones that are still with us, but they'll never be forgotten, and Nobby Stiles will never be forgotten, as will all of them. When you win a World Cup, you get a kind of footballing immortality, whether you're here or not.
And do they still make them like that?
I think the game has changed dramatically, of course, but you still get tough players. I don't think in the modern game, with the way it's refereed and the law changes, that you could probably be as aggressive as Nobby was, and he was noted for, obviously, his tough tackling. So you wouldn't get away with that in the modern game. But, you know, great players from different eras would adapt to the modern circumstances. But, yeah, he was kind of one of a kind in many ways, but perhaps more than one of a kind in his own times.
In a documentary that was screened in 2017, Stiles' son John said he was convinced that heading a football was responsible for his father's dementia. I mean, is that something that footballers of that generation feared?
I don't know whether they feared it back then, but obviously they played with a heavy ball. My friend Alan Shearer did a documentary on that very subject of whether heading the ball does damage you long term, and I think there's evidence that suggests that could be the case.